Imagine sitting at the controls of a contraption made from plywood and canvas, reinforced with wire. In front of you, through the thin wooden struts holding the wings together, you can see an aluminium cowled rotary engine. Between that engine and you are two Vickers machine guns, synchronized so you can, hopefully, fire a weapon without shooting off the propellers that are keeping you in the air. These propellers roar to life, and you lurch skywards. The machine, a piece of technology invented barely a decade earlier, lopes and wobbles in air currents. The battlefields of the Western Front open up beneath you and you struggle to hold your craft steady. Over the screaming of the engines, you hear the rat-a-tat-tat of gunfire. You're under attack. A plane arcs across your path and you turn and make eye contact with the enemy pilot just a few feet away from you. You see that he's just like you, filled with the same anxiety and adrenaline, the same hope of making it back home. But you must kill him, and he knows he must kill you. This was the reality for thousands of pilots who flew missions during the chaos and carnage of World War I. Kill or be killed hundreds of feet up in the air in machines that offered almost no protection from bullets and bombs. The British Sopwith Camel was one of the most famous of these planes, and its pilot spoke of the three crosses that Sopwith flyers could look forward to: the Victoria Cross for bravery and valor, the Red Cross for those wounded in combat, and the Wooden Cross for those who wound up dead. And yet, in the face of almighty peril and uncertainty, fledgling air forces made a real difference in the First World War. Today, we're going to be looking at which nation's air arm made the biggest difference, ranking 6 of the major belligerents in order, starting with the least effective and finishing up with the most. At the outbreak of war in 1914, the Russian Empire had a real asset on their side when it came to air power. This asset went by the name of Igor Sikorsky. Sikorsky was a pioneer of aviation and would later be credited with the invention of the first mass-produced helicopter. In the years leading up to the war, however, Sikorsky focused on fixed-wing aircraft and helped produce some of the most formidable fighting and flying machines of the age. In 1913, Sikorsky's company launched the Ilya Muromets or IM series of aircraft. Conceived as a luxury passenger craft, the first IMs were launched to much fanfare in an imperial Russia that was keen to modernize its image on the world stage. With the outbreak of World War I, however, the country faced a much more pressing need, and Sikorsky worked with the Russian military to convert the IM series into the world's first 4-engined heavy bomber. The IMs were tough, able to withstand massive damage on their way to their targets. They also carried a significant payload, and even a single IM could wreak havoc on the enemy lines. But they were still vulnerable to attack from enemy fighters or from anti-aircraft fire from the ground. To accompany these lumbering leviathans of the air, Sikorsky developed the S-16 biplane, a more maneuverable fighter-class aircraft. Before the war, Russia's air force consisted mainly of outdated Nieuport planes imported from France. The actions of Sikorsky and his team made Russia a real power in the air. So, what went wrong? Why did Russia end up last place on our list? Well, there's a few reasons for this. First, vulnerability. The Ilya Muromets series was backed up by the S-16, but only from 1916 onwards. For the first 2 years of the war, the IMs often lacked the protection they needed to complete their missions. Second, a lack of trust in air power. At Tannenberg in the first weeks of the war, Russian General Alexander Samsonov received aerial reconnaissance reports regarding German troop movements. He dismissed this intelligence, and this led, at least in part, to a massive Russian defeat. The poor training of pilots was also an issue. Russian pilots did not receive the same high standard of education and development as those from the Central Powers, putting them at serious risk. Equipment too. The parachute was actually a Russian invention, designed by Gleb Kotelnikov just before the war, but was delivered to the pilots of other nations long before they became part of a Russian pilot's equipment. The idea of a pilot bailing out and just losing a valuable aircraft was just too much for Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich. Aircraft are more valuable than people, he said. We import them from abroad, so they should be taken good care of, whereas people are never in short supply. Then there was the roster of available aircraft. Sikorsky's IMs and S-16s were great, but there was simply not enough of them. Instead, outdated Nieupors made up the bulk of the fighting force, while the Anatra biplane arrived too late to make much of a difference. Pound for pound, the Russian Air Force was simply not a match for their enemy's planes. Finally, Russia's exit from the war. Despite the views of General Samsonov and some of his compatriots, Russia's Air Force proved pivotal in many engagements, especially during the Erzurum offensive against the Ottomans in 1916. But the October Revolution of 1917 spelled the end of Russia as a force in World War I. Aeronautical engineering and technology was advancing rapidly during World War I, but many of Russia's planes barely had time to get off the ground before the fighting came to an end on the Eastern Front. It's worth remembering that the first powered flight took place in 1903, only 11 years before the outbreak of war. Today, we might look at satellite reconnaissance as a form of futuristic warfare, but this technology has been around for decades. In World War I, generals and strategists, and the pilots themselves, were working with something far closer to the cutting edge of humanity's technological capability. This is why so many nations were still playing catch-up when war was declared in 1914. Austria-Hungary had launched its Imperial and Royal Military Aeronautical Establishment, or the Kaiserliche und Königliche Militär-Aeronautische Anstalt in Vienna in 1893. But this was largely focused on balloons and airships. It wasn't until 1910 that the military began experimenting with fixed-wing aircraft. As the continent lurched toward all-out conflict, Austria-Hungary was hard at work. Wiener Neustadt, Fischermend and Gurz became the centers for pilot training, and by 1913, the military had 7 aviation corps bases spread across the empire. A target of 15 companies outfitted with 90 aircraft, mainly the Lerner Pfeilflieger or Arrow Flyer and the Dietrich Tauben or Dove, was set for 1914, but this plan was beset by problems, and the actual strength of the Austro-Hungarian Air Force was well below this when war was declared. But the empire had powerful friends, namely their German allies. In 1914, the rebranded Austro-Hungarian Air Force, or the Kaiserliche und Königliche Luftfahrttruppen, was kitted out with German-made Hansa Brandenburg and Avatec reconnaissance platforms, enabling the Austro-Hungarians to mount a meaningful airborne resistance as conflict began in earnest on the Eastern Front. Even by the standards of those early months of World War I, the Dietrich Taube was an anachronism. Its sleek design and construction gave the machine its bird-like name, but it was no match for the more modern craft now taking to the skies over the Eastern Front. By 1915, the Taube was all but finished, and the Luftfahrttruppen was gaining teeth. German Fokker Eindeckers, along with Austro-Hungarian produced Lohners and Lloyd C-11s, gave the empire the fighting power it needed, but it struggled to keep pace with aeronautical development. One problem was the German attitude toward Austro-Hungarian air power. When the Fokker V4 triplane failed to rival the British Sopwith equivalent in factory testing, the German Empire didn't bother with their own formal examinations, they just passed it over to Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary was not always working with the best equipment, and they lacked the ace pilots of Germany, France and Britain. But despite all this, they maintained a strong presence in the air throughout the war, and this just about keeps them off the bottom of the list. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, 1903. The Wright brothers achieved the first powered flight, kicking off the age of heavier-than-air aviation. And yet, if the Austro-Hungarians were busy playing catch-up to their European neighbours in 1914, their cousins across the Atlantic were still on the starting line. Yes, powered flight may have originated in the USA, but the United States was way behind in the air power stakes by the time the First World War began. Except for the US, the war didn't begin in 1914. America didn't join the conflict until 1917, giving them 3 extra years to get their house in order. In 1914, there was still no United States Air Force. The Army's Signal Corps had been using reconnaissance balloons since the Civil War in the 1860s, but this practice was not formalized until 1907. And by the beginning of the war in Europe, there were only 26 qualified aviators in the entire US military. The United States did use planes in their operations in Mexico in 1916, but the squadron consisted of only 8 aircraft, none of which was armed. Perhaps there was simply no appetite for air power in the United States in the 1910s. Well, this is not strictly true. In fact, there was an appetite, a big one. Following the United States declaration of war in 1917, $640 million was set aside by Congress for the development of an air force. National newspapers ran breathless headlines discussing the great aerial fleets that would crush the Central Powers. Colonel Reynald Bolling, Major Benjamin Falloy, who had commanded the squadron in Mexico, and General William Mitchell saw an opportunity and began lobbying for further investment and development. The appetite was there, the money was there, and the infrastructure was there. Mass-produced cars were already a fixture on American roads after all, and so the way was clear for a formidable American force in the skies. In the end, the American Air Force that saw action in the skies over Europe was cobbled together from a collection of British, French, and Italian aircraft. American-made planes like Curtis's, Benoit's, and Martin's were among them, but the bulk of the fighting force came from abroad. A little late to join the fray, the American Air Service ran missions for only 9 months, from February to November of 1918, but it certainly made its mark. The US ran 150 separate bombing missions, dropping around 138 tons of ordnance. Fighters brought down 756 enemy aircraft, while the US lost 289 planes. American squadrons constituted only 10% of the Allied planes over Europe, but they took a significant toll on their enemies. There were also American pilots operating outside of the United States military. The Lafayette Escadrille was a French squadron that consisted mainly of American volunteers. In May 1916, American ace Kiffin Rockwell achieved the squad's first kill in the skies over Alsace. The following month, Victor Chapman would be the first American airman killed in the conflict when his plane was brought down over Douaumont. As a testament to the lethal nature of these early aerial encounters, Rockwell himself would become the second fatality in September, shot through the chest by the gunner of a German Albatross he had engaged and dead before his plane hit the ground. In February 1918, many of the surviving members of the squadron were absorbed into newly formed American units. The expertise and bravery of these pilots would prove critical in the formation of the new US Air Force. Born in Nottingham in 1896, Albert Ball was barely 18 when he signed up for combat in 1914 and saw action at Passchendaele. He'd never touched a plane and had probably barely even seen one before the war, but by 1917, he was one of Britain's top fighter aces. His letters home talk of daring exploits, a distaste for killing, a cavalier attitude for his own safety, and a grim acceptance of the deaths of his comrades. The Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, famous in Germany and infamous everywhere else, described him as the best of the British flyers. Ball would not survive the war. The popular tale is that he was downed by the Red Baron's own brother, Lothar, but historians believe that it was engine failure that clipped the wings of one of the UK's best. He was reportedly so highly regarded by German troops that they considered a daring mission to return his body to the British lines, although they would eventually see sense and abandon this approach. The story of Ball is, in many ways, illustrative of what the Royal Flying Corps was all about. Pilots of astonishing bravery, doing battle in machines that were formidable on their day but prone to unreliability, scoring victories and writing their names into the history books but ultimately losing their lives, were brought down to die in unceremoniously French and Belgian fields. This is why the UK's Royal Flying Corps, or the Royal Air Force from 1918 onwards, ranks in 3rd place on this list of the most effective aerial forces, but no higher. The First World War drove air power forwards across the continent and across the world, but in the UK, the progress was nothing short of astounding. At the outbreak of the war, the average flight speed of the Royal Flying Corps aircraft was 60 miles or 97 kilometers per hour. As it became clear that aerial supremacy would be key in the conflict, speeds almost tripled, hitting 150 miles or 241 kilometers per hour, while engine power exploded from around 70 horsepower to more than 400. By the end of the war, the number of personnel involved in flying and maintaining these aircraft had grown from around 1,500 to more than 205,000. The most famous of the British planes was probably the Sopwith Camel. The biplane design has become synonymous with the dogfights and close quarters aerial combat of the First World War. This was certainly a highly capable aircraft, a deadly weapon in the hands of the most skilled fighter aces like the Australian Harry Cobby. By 1918, the ship's Camel naval variant was introduced, able to launch from aircraft carriers and adding another element to the capabilities of British air power. However, the plane proved difficult to handle and losses were heavy. It was difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to train new pilots, and Britain struggled to establish true air superiority at any point in the war. Britain made many innovations in air power during the war, including the first strategic bombing runs operated by the Royal Air Force in 1918. Despite this, the massive casualties suffered by her air crews blunted the effectiveness of her military arm. Perhaps this has contributed to the archetypal image of the British fighter ace during the First World War. Fearless, courageous, even glamorous, but doomed to an early grave. In second place on our list, France. It's no accident that the fledgling air forces of Russia and the United States were bolstered by French planes like the Nieuport. France was among the biggest producer of planes in the early decades of the 20th century, while aviation pioneers like Louis Blériot ignited the spirit of innovation and invention. France produced nearly 68,000 aircraft during World War I, supporting both their own aéronautique militaire and the air arms of their fellow allies. This is nearly 10,000 more than the British in second place and almost 20,000 more than Germany in third. At the outbreak of war in 1914, France's 138 frontline combat aircraft put her behind Russia, Germany, and Italy. This had grown to 4,500 by 1918, streets ahead of all her enemies and all her allies. But it wasn't just a matter of numbers. The French Air Force was also highly effective. Adolphe Péroux is widely considered the first fighter ace of the war and was certainly the first to be called that after being dubbed as it by the French media. René Fonck achieved 75 confirmed victories during the conflict and would probably be a household name to this day if it wasn't for a certain Manfred von Richthofen who scored 5 more. Maurice Beaulieu, flying in the French-produced SPAD-8 aircraft, achieved 35 victories in just over a year and a half of combat before he was shot down and killed in September 1918. France had excellent planes and excellent flyers and proved to be the scourge of all they faced. This spectacular airborne aggression, coupled with shrewd usage of reconnaissance and observation craft, put France at the very forefront of aerial operations during the war. So why do we find France in second place? Why doesn't the Aéronautique Militaire take the top spot for our list? One factor is the scope of French innovation. Unlike most of the other nations involved in the conflict, at least those with a developed air force, France did not develop multi-engine bombers, and so they lagged behind in terms of air-to-ground attack strategies. Perhaps an even greater factor, however, is the scale of their losses. Yeah, the French produced enormous amounts of aircraft between 1914 and 1918, but they suffered immense losses too. The 52,640 aircraft that either crashed, were shot down, or were otherwise damaged almost double the losses of Germany. France were great candidates for the number 1 spot, but they don't quite make it to the top of this particular list. 187 pilots scored 20 or more victories during the First World War. 75 of these pilots, more than 1/3, were flying for the German Empire. Of course, this includes Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and his brother Lothar. But it includes less well-known names too. Werner Voss, a member of von Richthofen's famous Flying Circus, and Fritz Rümi achieved 48 and 45 victories respectively. Rudolf Berthold and Bruno Lotzer tied with the Royal Flying Corps' Albert Ball on 44, while Paul Bäumer scored 43. These Knights of the Air proved a tactical advantage, damaging and destroying expensive enemy aircraft and neutralizing pilots that the Allied powers found difficult to replace. But they also offered a psychological benefit to the troops on the ground. While the infantry struggled in the muddy hell of no man's land and faced off against one another in a warren of trenches and emplacements, fighter duels took place above the lines, up in the air, often in the most visible of locations. When German planes downed enemy aircraft, the infantry would often witness this and be cheered as a result. The German Empire was assisted by its vast manufacturing resources, and this resulted in some of the most capable aircraft deployed by any force during the war. Fokkers and Albatrosses were among the most technically advanced planes in the air at the time, while Junkers produced some of the first all-metal aircraft. German engineers and innovators were truly getting to grips with what war in the air was really all about, and they were making their expertise shown. The Battle of Verdun, which lasted for almost the entirety of 1916, showcased how important air superiority really was on the Western Front. In the first months of the battle, Germany was able to exert almost complete domination in the skies above the battlefield, gathering valuable intelligence and striking terror into the French lines. It took a massive diversion of resources to wrest back control of the air. It was a similar story at the Somme, with France relying on their vast industrial output to tip the scales in their favour, producing an enormous number of planes to counterbalance the effectiveness of the German squadrons. But while France produced more aircraft than anyone else in the war, they were consistently forced to play catch-up to the technological capability and undeniable skill of the German Air Force. Over the course of the First World War, it was the German Empire who used their aerial forces most effectively, laying the groundwork for the devastating efficacy and efficiency of the Luftwaffe 2 decades later. Of course, the Germans were far from unopposed in the sky. The 48,537 aircraft they lost put a huge strain on the military, as well as on the civilian infrastructure and domestic economy that supported the war effort. Still, losses were considerably less than those incurred on the French and British sides, and it's the German Empire that takes the crown on our list of the most effective World War I air forces. Technology and warfare tend to go hand in hand. Humankind first took flight in 1783 when Jean-François Pilatre de Rosières used technology pioneered by the Montgolfier brothers to ascend to the skies attached to a hot air balloon. Some 11 years later, the French military deployed their own hot air balloon at the Battle of Fleurus in 1794, reconnoitering enemy positions. So it was with powered flight, only 11 years after the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, European militaries were battling one another in the skies over the western and eastern fronts, turning an enormous scientific breakthrough into a weapon of death and destruction. Mercifully, we haven't yet seen the same thing happen with space rockets and shuttles. By the end of the war, no one was in any doubt. Aerial combat was the future. In the next great conflict, air power would even be more critical. The Battle of Britain and the Battle of Midway, two turning points in the conflict, would see aircraft playing an even greater role than ever before. Before this new conflict drew to a close, humanity would see yet another scientific breakthrough accelerated and then harnessed by the power of warfare: nuclear energy. The bonds between technology, science, and military interests, it seems, are more difficult to split than an atom. For now though, let's stay focused on the First World War. What did you think of our list? Is there anything you disagree with? Would you change the order at all? Let us know your personal order in the comment section below, and let us know why as well, because we're always keen to read it. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.